As I mentioned yesterday, India is in South India. So it's on the South Asian continent. And so in the south, I don't know if you can see my mouth, but on this side, we have the Indian Ocean. And then we have the Arabian Sea on the other side. So basically, the east, south, and west of India are surrounded by ocean. In the north, you have the Himalayan mountain range. And you also have the Hindu Kush mountain range. So it's surrounded by mountain passes. So it's like a natural fence on the northern border that's closing off the northern border. So if you think about it in terms of the geography, India has all of the geographical feature it needs to be an independent country. As all of you know, the Himalayas are among the highest mountains of the world. And they're extremely high mountains, and they're always covered with ice. And so for that reason, crossing the Himalayan range to make contact with the outside world is difficult. And if you think about the northeastern areas of India, there is the state of Assam, and then below that you have Burma. And so between the two of these, there are several deep gorges. And there are ways to go out through those paths. There are paths through there, but it's very difficult to go through. So going through the northeastern direction is difficult. Now, the best path or the best way into India is in the northwest section of India. There are some mountain passes and valleys that you can pass through, in particular in the area of Pakistan and the Khyber Pass. So there is a pass, and this is a very well-known pass. And in the past time, most of the invaders of India came through the Khyber Pass and then came from that direction. So that was a very important path of travel in terms of the ancient Indian history. So what I'd like to show you next, the reason why I'm showing you this, the area of India has the geography that supports maintaining a particular culture and a particular region, because it's difficult to have contact with the outside of the world. It's difficult for outsiders to come, and it's difficult to go out. And so this is a situation that is important for us to understand. So the next thing I'd like to speak about is and talk about the Indus River. And the reason why we call India or Hindustan is because of the name of the Indus River. And so that Indus River is called the Sindhu River in Sanskrit. And in Tibetan, it's called the Singay Kabap, or the flow from the lion's mouth. And it comes from Mount Kailash in Tibet. It flows from the western slopes of Mount Kailash. And so Tibet is up in the north, right? So when it comes from the highlands of Tibet, and flows down from the west directions and comes down into India. In the upper regions of the Indus Valley, there are five large tributaries that join it. And that area where those five rivers join it is what we call Punjab. And that's the reason why it's called that, as I explained before. But in any case, this area of the five great rivers is called the Punjab. And so this is a large plain. In the end, they all join the Indus River, and they flow into the Arabian Sea, as I mentioned yesterday. So the important thing we need to know about this is that the Indus River Valley is a good region for agricultural work. It's an excellent region for agriculture. And this is also a region that is an important source for ancient Indian culture. And it is also important for connection with the outside world. Because the reason is, as I just mentioned, is that most of the invaders have come through the northwest in the paths through the Khyber Pass and so forth. And they came through this region. It was difficult for them to come from any other direction. And so the region of Punjab is close to the Khyber Pass. And so it's an important travel route for connection with the outside world. And so when the foreigners invaded India, they would first come and seize the area of Punjab, and then they would continue eastward into the Ganges River Valley. The Ganges River Valley is, of course, an important area, so they would then also invade those areas. And the reason is that the Ganges River is the longest of all the rivers in India. Its length is over 3,000 kilometers. I mean, its source is in the Himalayan regions, and then it flows down through India. And there are also many tributaries to the Ganges, but the most important of these is the Yamuna River. So the Ganges River is here. I don't know if you could see the mark I'm making. And then the largest tributary is the Yamuna. And so the place where these come together is like the most fertile region of India. It's the best area for agriculture. In the Yamuna, there's the Ganges and the Yamuna. And their confluence, the place where they join, was the center of ancient Indian culture and politics and trade and so forth. And so it's also, even these days, the current capital of Delhi. So to the west of Delhi, there are some highlands, and so that region, the highlands to the west of Delhi, is like the border between the watersheds of the Indus River Valley and the Ganges River. Now, the marks I'm making, you can't see the marks I'm seeing, but the divide between the two watersheds is in Delhi. And so for that reason, So Dili is on a very important travel way between these two rivers. And so in military terms, Delhi is a very strategic site. So for this reason, in ancient India, where there are wars between different kingdoms, they would see if they could take the Delhi and its surrounding regions. And this is a decisive area to fight over. Particularly in the 13th century, Delhi became the capital of India. It's like a hub from which they could take control over both the Indus River Valley and the Ganges Valley. So if we're looking at this area, you can see it clearly, right? Okay, in any case, in India, it's surrounded either by oceans or by high mountains or by glaciers. And so going in and out is very difficult. Even within India, there's the places are not all the same altitude. The largest plain is the Ganges River plain, and also there's the Sindhu, the Indus River basin. Other than that, in the region of India, there are mountains, and there are many places with uneven terrain, and there are many different rivers. And when we look at the texts from the culture and from the religious texts, we can see that they often made divided regions. It's often very difficult to travel from one region to another. And so for that reason, if we think about it in one perspective, if we think about it in a good way, the rivers and mountains created natural boundaries. And so this allowed many different regions with different politics and different cultures to remain. If we think about it on the negative aspect, if we look at it from a different perspective, there are so many different regions that were living independently, and so they had many different peoples, very different types of languages. And it created a lot of difficulties for uniting India. And this is primarily because of the geographical features. So this is an important thing for us to understand. And so that is a discussion of the geography of India. And so within this region of India, when did humans first arrive in this area? The earliest, when we were looking for the traces of the oldest humans, the earliest signs are found in the sign from the Paleolithic era period, the oldest Stone Age. It's difficult to exactly say what the Stone Age or the Paleolithic period is, but the reason we call it the Paleolithic or the Stone Age is that in the old days they did not know how to use bronze or iron, and so they could only use stone, and so they only knew how to make stone tools. And so for that era, when they only used the stones, is called the Stone Age or the Paleolithic. The old area is called the Paleolithic. And so there's in the area of the Indus River Valley, there were Paleolithic regions. And so these, if we think about it in terms of the dates, this is probably from about 400,000 BC until 100,000 BC. This is a very long time ago. Then if we think about the Mesolithic area, the Middle Stone Age, when we look for the architectural sites of those, if you find the traces of people, they can be found all over. And so it's a larger area than in the Paleolithic area. And these are only from about 40,000 years ago to about 5,000 BC. And so that is the historical or the archaeological evidence from that period. And so we had the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and then we had the Neolithic area. And when that began was probably it is about 5,000 years BCE. So that was the beginning of the Neolithic area in India. And how do we know that how do we find the remains? It's that when you unearth different architecture artifacts, then you can see them, and you can look at them. And so these are found in regions that are over a much larger area than even in the Mesolithic area. So the most well-known areas of where the Neolithic artifacts are found are in the South in India. And so they're in the South India. I don't need to mention all the names today because the names are so complicated. So I'm not going to mention them. Now, at the end of the Neolithic era, or just at some period of time after that, what happened is that there was, at the end of that, they began practicing agriculture. Before that, they didn't know how to practice agriculture. So they learned how to plant crops and so forth. They began agriculture. So there's some sites where they began agricultural practices. However, at that time, they only had stone tools to use. They did not yet have the technology for using bronze or iron tools. And so only when it came later that they began using Bronze Age. In addition, they also learned how to spin and weave and create ropes. And then at that time, and when they've unearthed many different archaeological artifacts, they also found many different turquoise and gems from East Asia. So not only did they practice agriculture, they also engaged in trade. And so the time when this culture appeared, they can tell that this type of a culture appeared at that time. So what does this tell us? Is at first they only knew how to use the stone tools, and then as a period, and then they used both stone and bronze together, and there was a new culture as human knowledge increased, and so that shows that the knowledge increased at that time. So that age, when they used the stone and bronze together, and what the archaeologists call this, they call this the early Harappan civilization. Yesterday, I will describe that later. So this is called the early Indus Valley or early Harappan civilization. And this civilization appearing is really very important. The reason it is because it shows that it is the beginning of a new period in a new chapter in the Indian history. So now after this, I'd like to yesterday I spoke about the 4 different periods of Indian history. I spoke about this yesterday, right? So when we talk about the periods, maybe it's okay to say that. Often use the term, in Tibetan, the word we use for period is the same as the word used for century. So perhaps we use a different word in Tibetan, the Dutsam in Tibetan. So this is a period in English. So if we talk about there are 4 different periods in Tibetan, in Indian history, whether you call them 4 periods or 4 eras. This is what I was speaking about yesterday. So in these four areas that began in the first of these is the period of the Indus Valley civilization. Now, I think that we can divide the Indus Valley civilization into two areas. The first we call the Indus Valley civilization. The period of the time of this is from 3400 to 1800 BCE. And this is the time period of that. And following that, there was the post-Indus Valley civilization. That time is the time after the Indus Valley civilization had declined. It's just the culture of this civilization that happened at that time. So this is from the 18th century BC until the 16th century BC. And so the first of these is the Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley civilization, if you wonder how did that originate, basically about around 3,300 years BC. And the reason we know that it's that time is that recently the archaeologists and other scientists, it's the results of researches by scientists, including archaeologists. So if we estimate that it began around 3,300 BCE. And so beginning from that time, the Indus Valley civilization used both the bronze and the stone tools together, and so this is like a new era in the history. And this knowledge, in terms of the civilization, became very important in Indian history. It's like the first civilization in Indian history, and so the name we give to this is the Indus Valley civilization. Another name of it is the Harappa civilization. That's another name for it. And that civilization is, in terms of the world, it's like one of the oldest and most impressive civilizations, one that we can take pride in. It's really very excellent and great civilization. Now, this Indus Valley civilization, at first, in the past, no one knew about it. No one knew about it. So when did we learn of it? It wasn't a very long time ago that we first learned of it. We learned of it recently. What happened is that from 1921 to 1922, they excavated sites at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. They excavated all the remains from ancient times, and when they unearthed these, and because of that excavation, they realized that there was only then did they realize that there was an Indus Valley civilization. Before that time, no one knew that there had been such a civilization before these excavations. And so from that time on, so that time was when India was under British control. Later, after India and Pakistan achieved independence, they have continued many different stages of research into the Indus Valley civilization. Now, in the past, they found it on two sites, the two sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. They couldn't find any other sites. But as they continued to search for sites, And they saw that the area that of the Indus Valley civilization was actually quite large, and so it actually went outside the river valleys, and it became and it covered a very large area. So here's the mat, and as you can, and it shows very clearly how it is. It's the one with the yellow or with the tan spot on it. That tan spot, that tan area, is the area where the shows the extent of the Indus Valley civilization. It shows you the size. It represents the size of the greatest extent of the Indus Valley civilization. Now, there are many different names and things about talk about the map, but I don't need to mention them all. In any case, the Indus Valley civilization covered a very large area, and among all the ancient civilizations in the world, it is larger than the areas covered by the ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt were very well-known civilizations. But the area covered by the Indus Valley civilization was larger than the area covered by both the ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so for that reason, it's a very large area. And in many areas covered by this, there have been several hundred archaeological sites discovered. And among these, the ones that we need to take a pyramid one important point we have to understand is that there are 5 or 6 different areas where there are remains of ancient cities. Now, the largest of these is the one that I mentioned earlier, the city of Mohenjo-Daro. And if we kind of take estimates on it, we say it is an area that had about 30,000 inhabitants. And so for these reasons, the Indus Valley civilization had a very high level of development and was an urban civilization. At first, the Indus Valley civilization, and if I'd like to show you this, I think it's good to just show you this. And I think if I show you this, it'll be more clear to you. As I said before, this is the archaeological site at Harappa, and now this one is the site of Mohenjo-Daro. I think the Tibetan is not good. Anyways, these are the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. When they first found the ruins of these cities, and they started to estimate the dates of the city, and there have been many different dates that scholars have proposed for this, but in recently they have been using carbon dating, and so using carbon dating techniques. And so we now have the technology for this one examining these. The results that come back is that the Indus Valley civilization was from 2300 BC to 1750 BC. And so it's been been determined fairly clearly that this is the time period of this. But the civilization itself, the origin of this, so this civilization appeared first in an Indian area of India and developed there. Or Was it someone bringing it from another region, bringing it to India, and then India developed? And so now there's researchers have different opinions on this. In the formerly, so in former, then like a few decades ago, the scholars mainly thought that this civilization must have been brought from outside of India. And so that was their hypothesis at that time. But as they've gradually done more and more research, most scholars say that actually that this civilization the people who founded this civilization who took it from being nothing into being civilization are of the local residents of that area. It was not brought from outside. And there's no source indicating that it was brought from outside, as the scholars say. Now, when you think, well, the people who were in this region, who do we mean? When we talk about the people from this region, what we mean are generally before the Indus Valley civilization flourished, there were several ethnic groups that had come to India. And when we talk about the different ethnic groups, there's the Dravidian peoples, there's also the Kolarian peoples, and there are the Mundas. And so there are several different ethnic groups that had come from outside of India to India. And they had come to India several thousand years before. So among these many different people who had come to India several thousand years before and who had settled in India, they had been on a very long time. They had to stay there, and they'd become the indigenous people of India. And so they became the people who lived, they had the peoples that had lived longest in India. And among them, and so it is said that it's probably the Dravidian peoples who first developed the Indus Valley civilization. So that is the hypothesis. And also with the Indus Valley civilization, the most important particular feature of it is that it has the features of an urban civilization, as I can show you. This is what I'm showing you. There's the drawing, right? They found so many ruins of cities, and because of looking at those ruins, scholars have made this drawing based upon the ruins that they found. So at that time, it was there had been a creating development of civilization, and they lived in an urban setting. And living in the city, they primarily lived through crafts, handcrafts, and through trade. In particular, the artifacts that they unearthed include many fragments of pottery that have been painted in color. And they are very finely crafted works. In terms of the craftsmanship, they're very high quality. Likewise, the stone tools and also other stone arts, there are quite a few of those as well. They're also very high quality. And the craftsmanship is very precise and fine. They also found it's clear that they had a lot of textile weaving and textile, as well as a lot of trade. So the next thing I'd like to show you, that's That's a stone statue unearthed in the as one of the artifacts from the civilization, as well as they also had seals or stamps that that have these artifacts have all been excavated as well. Now, at that time, the city of that time was not like a chaotic jumble. Instead, actually, it had been well planned. They can deduce from the remains. Like if you look at the planning and the shapes, the houses, you could see that their level of technology was actually very high. For example, the walls were very good. They knew how to build walls. They knew how to build they knew how to make rooms for washing and living rooms and bathroom. They had many different they had smithies where they worked with bronze and other houses and tombs and so forth. Now, in particular, they also covered many stamps, as I'm showing. They found several thousand of such stamps. Now, these stamps, on the top of all of them, they have both letters and drawings, right? If you can see here, like there is a picture of an ox or an elephant, and above that, what's written above it is probably some sort of writing. Not only did they have writing and letters, but they also found pottery fragments and also metalwork that had writing on it. But this is such an ancient form of writing. Many researchers have gone to a lot of work, but up to now they have not been able to decipher the script. And so because they cannot read this, they have many different questions about the Indus Valley civilization, but they cannot answer many of them. And the reason is that if we could understand their writing, we would be able to understand the situation, but we are unable to read their writing. So for that reason, we can only have hypotheses about who the people who initiated the civilization were, but we cannot actually really definitively decide who they are, who developed the civilization, who maintained the civilization. We cannot really answer that question decisively. And that's one point. Now, at the time that the Indus Valley civilization flourished, we can infer that there is that there's a great deal of religious worship of gods and so forth. And the reason is that they have excavated many artifacts that are related to religious worship. And so there are many such religious articles that have been unearthed. In particular, there are many of these seals and many of the stone statues are probably related to religious worship. And so we can infer this from the evidence. And it's not that they worshipped a single god. It seems that they worshipped many different gods. And so some of the gods have human forms, and there are also some of the gods with animal forms. And so you can see that they worshipped such gods as well. For example, in India, later there is Indra, who is considered very important in India. There is a god, there are drawings of a god who is very similar in form to the god Indus in the artifacts from the Indus Valley civilization. And there are also many female figures among the religious artifacts from the Indus Valley civilization. And so for that reason, we have to see that they not only had faith in male gods, they also had faith in female goddesses. And so, and for the main important, this is an important part for us to understand in terms of the development of secret mantra. Now, as I mentioned, there is a scholar from Japan called Yuke Matsunaga, who's a very important scholar on the secret mantra. And his point is that this non-Aryan tradition had a great influence on later Indian culture. It's not this Indus Valley civilization is not an Aryan civilization, because it was after the Indus Valley civilization had disappeared that the Aryans first came to India. So the Indus Valley civilization is not an Aryan civilization. Now, it's unnecessary to mention that the Aryan peoples had a great influence on Indian civilization, but it's also, we can say that the Indus Valley civilization had a great influence on Indian civilization. And in particular, in the secret mantra Vajra, there are many features of the secret mantra that show the form, that exhibit forms and traces of the non-Aryan culture that have been incorporated into secret mantra Vajrayana, as this Japanese scholar had said. Now, if you want to say, well, what are these features of the non-Aryan situation? Well, these are things that we'll speak about later. And so I think we'll now leave it for here today, and then in a half an hour, we will continue with the teaching. Now I'll continue with the teaching. Now, we've been talking about the Indus Valley civilization achieved a high, and how it achieved a high level of development. And so how do what level of development did it reach? To speak about it in English, we say it had like a social classes. There were probably some sort of a leader, perhaps a king, or then below that there are military figures. So we talk about ranks of nobility. So there's probably some sort of a level of classes. And so it had achieved the society achieved a great level of social development. And this Indus Valley civilization is probably the first form of a state or first form of a country in there. And in order to have a state, you have to have a city. And not only was there one city, there were 5 or 6 different ruins of cities. And so it is probably the first time that states had developed in India. However, the details of the society and the states cannot be described accurately, and the reason is because we've found a few artifacts from underground, but other than that, we haven't got any manuscripts or any other information. Prior to the artifacts being unearthed, no one knew at all that there was any Indus Valley civilization. It was not recorded in history, and no one knew anything about it. So it was only after the artifacts had been unearthed that the people realized, oh, in the past there was this sort of a civilization. Not only was there civilization, it also had a very high level of development. Only then could they infer these facts. So in the end, this Indus Valley civilization disappeared very quickly. It disappeared. And the reason why it disappeared is, and so what some scholars say is that prior to that, the Indus Valley civilization So some scholars say that it's because of the Aryan invasions of India that the Harappan civilization disappeared, and it's because of their arrival that the Indus Valley civilization disappeared. And there have been some scholars who have held those positions. However, currently, as archaeologists examine the regions where Indus Valley civilization artifacts have been found, and there are many ruins and many different sites. And as they examine all of these, they can see that there's no evidence for the postulate of earlier scholars that the Indus Valley civilization disappeared upon the arrival of the Aryans. And the reason why they can say this is that the reason is that the arrival of the Aryans in India is several hundred years after the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization. Only a few hundred years after it disappeared did the Aryan peoples arise. At the time that the Indus Valley civilization was flourishing, the Aryan people had not arrived. So for this reason, we can say that the idea that the Indus Valley civilization disappeared on the arrival of the Aryans is not accurate. The second thing is that if the Aryans had, if the Indus Valley civilization had disappeared on the arrival of the Aryans, then at that time there would have to been armed conflict, a war between the two. But when we look at the artifacts between the two, we don't see any signs of there having been a war, in particular of any conflict with the Aryan people. And so for this reason, they say that there is no evidence for or source for the earlier idea that it had been the arrival of the Aryan peoples that destroyed the Indus Valley civilization. In any case, the fully developed civilization, how long did it remain? It probably lasted for over 600 years. And after remaining for about 600 years, then it declined. And the time that decline happened is probably about 1750 years BC. Now, if we wonder what is the cause or the condition that caused that civilization to actually decline and disappear, these days the researchers and scientists are not able to describe it. Now, people have different opinions. Say maybe it's this, maybe it's that. There's a lot of guesswork, but there's no definitive answer. Now, some people say is that the cities were destroyed, and the trade therefore also then ceased. And they also, prior to that, had many different crafts, pottery, making stone figures. They had many different craft works, and those also declined. And the people who inhabited the cities had to spread to many different areas. And then gradually, the civilization underwent a great decline and eventually disappeared. Now, there was one area called Lotar. I'm not sure that's the Chinese word, but I'm not sure what it's called in English, maybe Lotar. So in that one area of Lotar, then the civilization or the culture was able to remain in this area of Lotar. And so it's able to list a little bit longer in there, but in all the other areas, the civilization declined quickly. Now, the reason why it declined so quickly is that what many scholars say is that it's primarily changes in the climate. The weather changed, the climate changed. And because of that, the civilization declined, they say. And the reason they say this is because when they look at the Remands, they see the signs that there had been floods and other destruction. So it seems that at one time there was a great environmental destruction or disaster, and many people left. Now it's quite possible that a few remained, but most people had to flee, and because of that, it probably declined. Or alternatively, there might have been a great famine, and there was nothing to eat. And so for that, and many people died at one time and it declined. Or perhaps there was some sort of other event that occurred that meant that the people would no longer be able to remain in the location. And so they had to flee to other locations. And so that could be another reason for its design. Or perhaps there was a great drought and then the crops failed or something like that. But the main thing they're saying is that it's probably because of changes in the climate or changes in the weather that this civilization had to decline. And so that's the main reason that people think. And what some scholars say is that it's possible there was a natural disaster. And then in addition to that there might have been invaders from abroad, and it's probably because of that it divided. But who the external peoples would have been, no one can say. In any case, it's impossible that there was a natural disaster, and impossible that in addition to that there was an invasion. And because of that, there's probably the civilization probably declined. And so that's one of many different postulates, hypotheses. But it just seems that in this area there was a natural disaster, and many people died, and that caused hardship and difficulties. No, in any case, in the end, the Indus Valley civilization did disappear. Though it disappeared, even though it declined, it still had a great influence on the further developments of Indian civilization. As I've already said before, the Indus Valley civilization had reached a very high level. And because it was so highly developed, the people who were there were able to keep many of the most important developments that happened. Now, most of the elements of the civilization declined, but there is there is no independent or autonomous independent Indus Valley civilization, but many aspects of its civilization continued. For example, there are the agriculture, the different types of crops they planted, the way the culture of raising livestock, or the technology of livestock, their weaving, and also their craftsmanship. And so these crafts and weaving and so forth were all continued. Similarly, as I explained before, as I mentioned, there was a religious tradition of worshiping gods, and particularly of worshiping goddesses, as I mentioned. And so at that time, they worshipped goddesses, and there was a tradition of worshiping the god Indra, as I mentioned before. And so that tradition later also continued in the Brahmanic tradition and was maintained in that tradition. And so for that reason, even though the Indus Valley civilization declined and disappeared, it was not able to continue as an independent entity, but many elements of its culture were then incorporated into the overall culture of India. And so in the development of Indian culture, the Indus Valley civilization had a very strong impact, a high influence. Now, as I mentioned before, the Indus Valley civilization had two stages. The first part was the Indus Valley civilization itself. And then the second part was the post-Indus Valley civilization. And the post-Indus Valley civilization was the period after the Indus Valley civilization had declined and a new culture developed. Now, it was not as highly developed as the Indus Valley civilization. So what happened is that at that time, they're trying to repeat what had happened in the previous era. And so the Indus Valley civilization was it was a time when they used both stone tools and bronze tools. But in the post-Indus Valley civilization, the culture that happened in the areas of the Indus Valley civilization did not have that technological advances. They did not know how to use metal tools, or they were unable to use metal tools. And so this is a new culture that arrived. They had reverted to the Neolithic technology. And so that new culture was not a primarily urban civilization, right? The Indus Valley civilization was a very highly developed and elaborate urban civilization. And after the Indus Valley civilization declined, then the new culture was a village culture. And the tools were stone tools. And so it's like they had returned to reverted back to the Neolithic age. And so that is kind of the form that they have. And what we call that is, as I mentioned before, is called the post-Indus Valley civilization. And so that's the name we call it by. And the time that this culture occurred was from around 1500 BC. Now that culture, between that culture and the Indus Valley civilization, was there a connection? Of course there was a connection. But the people who started this new culture, who probably, where did they come from? There were probably people who came to, it's probably people who were from northwest India who came and who revived it. Or it could have been Aryan peoples who had already arrived, and they then began this new culture. In any case, these are some of the hypotheses. But the main thing is what I'm saying here. I'm talking about North India. I'm talking about the development of civilization and culture in North India. However, India is a huge country. In the South India and the East India, what sort of a civilization and culture did they develop? Their cultures were probably primarily in the Neolithic technology. So from the Neolithic age, they gradually developed. And they also, in the east of India and South India, they also developed their own independent civilizations that had no contact with the other civilizations, in particular, no connections with those connections in North India, especially the Indus Valley civilization I just mentioned. And so they developed their own independent civilizations in their own regions, it seems. And so at that time, in all the areas of India, the east, west, south, and north, there are many different new cultures that developed. And all of these cultures were all founded by people of different ethnic groups. They had different origins. And all these cultures reached many different levels of development. It's not like they're all a single culture with a single origin with the same level of technology. However, as I said before, the Indus Valley civilization probably had a great influence on all of these different uh, uh, cultures. And it seems that for this reason, some who were able to continue some elements of the Indus Valley civilization, as I mentioned before. But the Indus Valley civilization and the cultures that developed later in other areas, the biggest difference between them is that the Indus Valley civilization reached a very high level of development. It became an urban civilization. The cultures in the other regions were either village cultures, and so it seemed like they were a little bit less developed cultures. So that's that. So that's the first period or the first era, the period of the Indus Valley civilization. So now we've come to the second period. Now, the second period is very important. Now, the second era is the Vedic period. The Vedic period Now, the second period. Now, this also has two different periods. There's the early Vedic period, or another area that's called can also be called the Punjab period. The reason why it would be called the Punjab period, I will explain later. Now, the dates of that period, it's like from the 15th century BC to the 11th century BC. The second is the late Vedic period. And this is also called the period of the development of philosophy. And this is from the 11th to the 6th century BC. Now, after the Indus Valley civilization developed, there was a new culture that appeared, as I mentioned. Now, so a little bit mistake. So after the Indus Valley civilization finished, a new culture developed, and that's what we call the Vedic period, or the Vedic age, the Vedic culture. Now, at that time, there's a great improvement in the way people thought, and the reason what happened, because many different philosophies and styles of thought arose. So at that time, so we describe it as two, as I mentioned before. It's as I meant before. There's the early Vedic period and the later Vedic period. These two. Now, before we speak about the Vedic period, we need to understand who the people who established it are, the Aryan people who established and who developed this civilization. And before we talk about the Aryan peoples, we first have to look at a map. Now, what this map shows us is, as I said before, the Aryan peoples, where did they come from? They came from outside of India, from other places. They came from other areas and migrated into India. And when they arrived was after the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization, some 200 or 300 years after that. That's when they first arrived. And their arrival in India was through the path, as I mentioned before. In the ancient times, the primary way into India was the northwest of India. Where there are several different paths, and so they came through these before arriving in India. They arrived gradually. It was in stages. It was not many people all at once. Those came in different groups and arrived in India. They arrived in India, and then they settled in India. So these Aryan peoples. So of the present-day population of India, a large percentage come from the Aryan peoples. Their ancestors are the Aryans. And the Aryans comes from the word Arya. Now, this is the word that means pakpa. I mean, it's like we talk about noble individuals and ordinary individuals. This means that Arya, that means the nobles and noble individuals. So that word Arya, it comes from the original from the Aryan language. And the meaning of Arya is superior. That's as we say it in Tibetan, it's pakspa. It means superior. And where this name comes from, it comes from the texts of the Vedas. And when they're saying Arya, is that the Aryan people, when they call this, they say, I'm Aryan. They say that Tibetans would say, I'm Tibetan, right? And similarly, the Aryan people would say, I'm Aryan. And so this is the name that the people gave themselves, saying, I'm superior. I'm from a good clan. I'm from a good family. I'm a superior person. Now, some scholars say that actually the meaning of the word Arya is to obey or to have faith, to worship, and explained as having this sort of a meaning. And the reason they say this is that the Aryan people consider themselves as being very faithful and religious people, saying, I have faith, I have devotion for the gods. And so when the Aryans arrived in India, there were people who did not have faith in the gods, who did not worship the gods. And in order to understand that, they could say, I'm someone who believes in the gods, and called themselves by that name. And so this is a position of some scholars. Now, another important point, as we've been describing before, is that some European scholars in the past, I didn't explain this before, I'm sorry. In the past, some European scholars said that Aryan is the name of an ethnic group. There's an Aryan mythic group. Like if we say you're Tibetan, you're a Tibetan, there's a Tibetan ethnic group. If you're saying Chinese, there's a Chinese ethnic group. And similarly, there's an Aryan ethnic group. And they identifies that. However, later, or that Arya is a race. And so later scholars looked at it and said there's actually no Aryan race. Actually, within the Aryan peoples, there are many different people of different ethnic groups. It's not a single ethnic group or a single race. And so for this reason, we say about Aryan is not all the same race or the same ethnic group. It's not okay to identify it as a single race. But the main point of the reason why they're called Aryans is because they're the same language. Even if they aren't the same ethnic group, they can have they can have they have the same language. And so this Aryan language is one of the Indo-European languages. And so this is called an Indo-European European language. And the reason we can know this is something you will, I think, understand as I explain this gradually. The Aryan people came first. They came from these Central Asian regions. And so they lived in a region of Central Asia. So it's that yellow area, it's in that yellow oval in the center. And so they originally lived in this region of Central Asia. And they were primarily nomadic peoples. And then probably around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, they divided into two groups. One of these went to present-day Europe. And so one group went to Europe. And as they went to the European continent, and so nowadays, the ancestors of most present-day Europeans are these Aryan peoples. Now, another group where they went to the east. And those who went to the east came to the Hindu Kush mountain range. They crossed this mountain range and came to the area of Kabul in present-day Afghanistan. And when they passed through that region, and so they followed the areas of the Harabi River in Afghanistan, and also came to the area of there's one of the rivers called the Sangirvis in the area of Punjab. And so there are these two rivers, one in Afghanistan and one in India. And so they came into the same areas and they settled in this region. And that region that they settled in, the people from there then again divided into two groups. One of these groups went from the west down to the south. They left from India, they went off toward the direction of the Arab countries. And so they arrived in Persia, or the present-day Iran. And when they arrived there, they developed the Persian civilization. So they were the ones who founded the Persian civilizations. And the remaining people continued to down to the southeast into India. And where they arrived in India was in the region of Punjab. They arrived in the region of Punjab and they settled there. And for this reason, those who arrived in the region of Punjab are called the Indo-Aryan peoples. So first, the Aryan peoples there, for their initial origin is from Central Asia. Some of them went to Europe, some went to Iran, and some came to India. But the first were all lived together, and that because they all together, they all had the same language. And those people, the one language, the same language, all went to different languages. Some went to Europe, some went to India, and some went to Persia. And so their mother language, or the mother of all their languages, is the same. And so for that reason, as I said, the Sanskrit language and the Western European languages, for example, Latin, come from the same mother. And that's the reason why we say this. And the reason is that they first all lived in the same region, and they're an ethnic group that all lived in the same region. There's a society that lived together. But when they spoke to each other, they had to be able to understand each other. And so, in order to understand each other, they have to use one language. But in the end, they all went to different places. But originally, they had the same language. But because there was such a long passage of time that their languages diverged and became different. So graphically, they're the ones who went to Europe, and those who went to Iran, we don't need to speak about them. Now, the ones we need to speak about now are the Aryans who came to India and settled in the region of Punjab. Now, the region of Punjab, the reason why it's called Punjab is that the word Punjab is that the Indus River has many different tributaries. And those tributaries, the five greatest tributaries, are there 5 rivers. And so among the many different tributaries, there are 5 major tributaries or 5 major rivers that flow into it. And so because of those 5 rivers, it's called Punjab. The name Punjab is actually in Persian. Panj means 5. Ab means river. And you put the two together, you get Punjab. So it means the 5 rivers. And the reason is they live in the basin of 5 rivers, and so it's called the 5 rivers or Punjab. Then in Sanskrit, it's called the Panchnada, or 5 rivers. Now, the reason it's talked about the 5 rivers, but actually, now, of course, there are many different. It's sometimes talked about as 7 rivers, but actually, it's the 7 is like all tributaries of the 5, and so for that reason, Punjab is called the region of the 5 rivers. So the Aryan people arrived in India newly, but before they came to India, there were indigenous Indian peoples who had lived in that area. There's that ethnic group that lived there, and that ethnic group was primarily a Dravidian group. But the Dravidian peoples, the Aryans really looked down on the Dravidian peoples. They would say, we're Aryans, we're superior, and you are a lower class or a lower type of people. You are inferior people. You don't have a lot of education. And so they thought of them as in that fashion. And so because of that, what should I say? When the Arya peoples arrived in India initially, they seized the area of Punjab. And when they seized that area, they came and they had some sort of a battle or conflict with the indigenous inhabitants, and in the battles, so there's a great war between them. And at that time, the Aryan people called the people of the original indigenous inhabitants, they called them Dasa, which means either enemy, like opponents. That means like the enemies that you're fighting against. And the Arya people would, the opponents of the Aryas were people with who were darkened skin. And when they spoke, and people who spoke in a way that was their language was coarse, and their noses were flat, and they didn't conduct sacrifices and so forth. They didn't consider sacrifices important, and so for that reason, many scholars, when they research and hypothesize about this, they say that the people that they call the enemies were probably Dravidian peoples. They say they infer that it's the Dravidian peoples were the enemies. If we compare it with the Dravidian people, the Aryan peoples were tall people. They were tall. They knew how to ride horses. And not only did they ride horses, they also had carts and chariots. And because they could ride chariots and as they fought in battle. Now, the Dravidian people, in terms of their so the Aryan people had superior weaponry and superior tactics to the people who lived in that area, so that they very easily subdued all the peoples who lived, the indigenous people who lived in that area. And after they did so, those people, the indigenous inhabitants had lost, and so the Aryan people then made them to slaves. And so the Aryan peoples then were the people who were in charge, and the indigenous people from that area, since they had lost, became slaves and peasants. So this is how it's explained that it happens. As the Aryan peoples then settled in Punjab, after a certain amount of time, and then the population grew. As the population grew, they thought to themselves that some of them thought that they went to a different to move to different regions. So from about the 12th century to the 9th century, the Aryan people had to move, and so they went to the areas of the Ganges River, and so they invaded the Ganges River Valley. And they also fought against the people, the original inhabitants of the Ganges River Valley. And in the end, the inhabitants of the valley just lost. And then not only that, the Arya people, how shall I say this? They formed states, or it became like the source or the hub of the development of their civilization. And not only that, the Aryan peoples, from one perspective, when they arrived in the region first arrived in a region and they fought the people in that region, they took power. They subdued all the people in those regions. In another area, when they arrived at a new area, they also borrowed the best from the original culture and the original inhabitants of those areas. They took those best areas and they combined them with their own culture and civilization, and brought and integrated them into their own culture. And so for that reason, as I mentioned before, there's the Japanese scholar I mentioned before, right? Yuki Mitsunaga. And this Japanese scholar himself actually was a Japanese bhikshu or monk, and he's one who conducted a lot of research into the topic of the secret mantra. And what he says about this is the Aryan peoples arrived in the Ganges River Valley, and while developing their civilization in the Ganges area, they mixed it, they incorporated elements of the original inhabitants of the Ganges River, and so these two mixed. There's a great connection happened in between the Aryans and the people and the original inhabitants of the Ganges, and so later. A new culture that had elements of both of these cultures then also developed, and there are many signs of this. Not only do we see this in Indian cultures, not only do we see signs of this in Indian culture in general, we see this in our secret mantra Vajrayana, that we have the combination of the different cultures. One sign of this is that, for example, in the secret mantra, we have the different we have the wrathful deities, and so the wrathful deities are not an Aryan deities. Now, whose culture? They are not an Aryan culture. They're actually, these wrathful deities came from the Dravidian peoples. So when we talk about if we look for the origin of the wrathful deities, if it comes from the Dravidian culture, and so it arises from the Dravidian culture, and later in the Gupta culture, then only at that point was the talk about the five great wrathful deities and so forth, was during only started spreading in the Vajrayana in the 5th century. Now, among the five great fifth centuries, we have like Vajrayaksha. So Vajrayakshini. It's like we talked about how in the Indus Valley civilization there was a lot of goddess worship, and so within Indus Valley, the goddess that they worshipped in the Indus Valley civilization was very similar to Vajrayakshini, and so we can say that there's a great relation between the Indus Valley civilization goddess and the Vajrayakshini. Likewise, we also talk about Panashavari, right, as well as the great king Vaishravana. These are also not from Arya culture. There's no discussion of this of Vaishravana or Panashavari in the Aryan culture. These originated from other cultures. Similarly, within the secret mantra, we talk about the great Piha, great Mayuri. The great Mayura, Mahamayura. And this word comes from the Munda language, the Munda peoples. In the Munda language, there's a word called Mora. And so the name of Mayura came from this word Mora, it's the great period. So it is not related to the original Aryan people. Likewise, in the secret mantra, we talk about the gods and the Nagas and the Yakshas and the Rakshas and so forth. This is in the secret mantra. It's not just in the secret mantra, it's also in the Mahayana too. And it's also mentioned in the foundation vehicle teachings too, in the Theravada teachings. And so the Aryan people, there's no mention of the Nagas in the Aryan culture, but in India, there were the cobras, right? The cobra snakes. They considered cobras to be very important. They became Nagas. And so they considered cobras to be like snakes, and they made offerings to them. And so so in the past, there was a culture that worshipped snakes in this way. And so they called this language called the Naga was a name for snakes as for cobras. And so that's why they talk about Nagas. So we talk about the culture about Nagas. is also from another Indian, non-Aryan Indian culture. Also particular of the secret mantra is that we have talked about have wrathful deities who eat human flesh. And many wrathful deities wear necklaces and bracelets worn of snakes or necklaces of human heads. And there's these appearances, right? And where this comes from is from the Dravidian peoples. The goddesses that the Dravidian people wore that sort of those sorts of accoutrements, like the snake, the necklaces of human skulls, and so there are such goddesses in the Dravidian cultures. So when we talk about wrathful deities in the Vajrayana, these all come from the Dravidian culture, and then were gradually incorporated into the secret mantra. So later, when we think about the human, when we think about the goddesses, the female goddesses, we can see the influence of the Dravidian people. And so their culture is like the basis for the different for the different ornaments and so forth that are worn by the wrathful female deities. And so basically, and within our secret mantra, we don't only have male gods, we also have female goddesses. There are many aspects that are related to goddesses. And so when we talk about the female gods, are not particularly related to the Aryan culture. They primarily come from other different types of peoples. But later, the Aryan people then incorporated the elements of other cultures into their people, into their own culture. And later, the Aryan people also began to worship goddesses and so forth. So it seems that initially they did not particularly worship goddesses. So in brief, so we can see that there's been a lot of influence of non-Aryan cultures on the secret mantra. And still, even within there, quite a bit. There are also many other aspects and things that we do not know about also for what we need to understand now. In order to know this, we have to need to understand we need to have great in the social sciences and various in archaeology and so forth. And only when we have great improvement in that, only then will we be able to understand how we have so many different forms of goddesses, the different many different types of ornaments and clothing that they wore. So all these are related to many of different cultures of India. There's from the Aryan culture, the Dravidian culture, the Munda culture. And so many of these cultures, many different cultures had relations. And because of this, in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, we have the many different male and female gods and goddesses and the different robes and ornaments and accoutrements that they wore. And so the secret mantra of Vajrayana combines the elements of many different cultures. And if to say this, there's nothing wrong with saying that. So for that reason, not that we as religious people take great interest in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, but also it's in terms of the culturally and in terms of the philosophy, we can see how this is all very important in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, because we see that in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, there's a combination of many different Indian cultures, the combination of many different histories, not philosophies, not only Buddhism, but also many other ancient Indian philosophies are contained within the secret mantra of Vajrayana. So for that reason, the secret mantra of Vajrayana is like a treasury of ancient Indian culture. It contains many of the essential elements of ancient Indian culture. So normally when we think about it, when we say secret mantra, we think about it in terms of a religious thing, something we consider important out of faith and devotion. But we don't understand the significance, the value that the secret mantra Vajrayana has in terms of Indian culture. We don't think about it, but it's important for us to keep this in mind. This is like a feature or a quality of the secret mantra Vajrayana. And so that's basically it. Now, if we were to talk about the early Vedic period, it's probably so it's probably enough for today. And so tomorrow we'll talk about the Vedics, the Vedas, and so forth. And there's also quite a lot to speak about the Vedic and the myths and so forth. Now, some of these myths are difficult to speak about it. But there's just no choice but to identify a few of the deities who are spoken about in the Vedic culture, and because they're so important in the Veda, in the secret mantra, and particularly in the secret mantra, we have some of the Vedas deities later became deities in the secret mantra Vajrayana, so they're very important in Indian culture and in secret mantra Vajrayana as well. So tomorrow is a day off, and the day after tomorrow we speak about the Vedas. I will give you an introduction to that subject, but right now, actually, as I said yesterday, I'm someone, I personally haven't studied history, and since I've never studied history, and so I'm thinking, if I kind of say I'm teaching Indian history, it's very difficult when you're just putting yourself in a high position. But there's no choice but to speak about Indian history. And the reason is that if you don't speak about Indian history, then you can't speak about Indian Buddhism history. And if you can't speak about Indian Buddhist history, then you can't speak about the history of secret mantra, which is a part of Buddhism. And so for that reason, I've given a brief history of India, and so then gradually I'll speak about how Buddhism, I'll give you a brief introduction to how Buddhism originated in India, and then how the secret mantra spread. And so these are what I will be introducing. The history of the secret mantra is something it is important for us to take interest in. And the reason for this is that the secret mantra Vajrayana has spread very widely in Tibet, but there are very few who have actually studied the history of the secret mantra Vajrayana. Now, there is some history of the individual tantras, but there's very little about the overall history of the secret mantra Vajrayana. So now, who is it who is researching this? Well, it's primarily the European sculptors and also the Japanese sculptors. Now, so what they can say whatever they want. Now they can say whatever, they can talk about whatever they want to, but for us Tibetan scholars, we can't even get a seat at the table to discuss that. Since we don't have a seat at the table, we're people who actually studied the secret mantra Vajrayana. We've been practicing the secret mantra for thousands of years. We hold the lineages, but we don't have any right to speak about the secret mantra. If we don't have any right to speak about, or status to speak about the secret mantra Vajrayana, no chair to speak about them, that would be a terrible situation, isn't it? And so for that reason, it's important for us to study the history of the secret mantra Vajrayana and gain a place where we can actually participate in international discussions about the secret mantra Vajrayana. It's a little bit better now than it used to be, but in the past, the way it was that foreign academics didn't really consider secret Vajrayana very highly, and in particular, they didn't consider Tibetan mantra are very important at all. The reason they said that this is not secret mantra Vajrayana, it's incorrect or wrong. It's not pure Vajrayana, they said. It is incorrect Vajrayana. And when they explain like this, we've never heard of this before. We're saying we have just too pure a view and we think we're doing great. But when people look from outside, they say, oh, Tibetan secret mantra, not mantra isn't good. We've already examined it. We've researched it. That's not good secret mantra. And so they're saying this, all this, but we haven't opened our eyes. We don't know about it. And so it's important for us to know this. And we need to understand this and be able to explain it and be able to give a reply to say we are not incorrect talking about the secret mantra. We have sources and origins for what we do. And in order to give the answer, we need to do the research ourselves. And so we say, if we say the three jewels are true, if whatever we talk about the three jewels or whatever we speak about, it's not going to help at all. So we need to do the research and have reasons and factual response. If we can explain it in that way, then we will be able to get some recognition for it. And so for that reason, it's important for us to take interest in and to learn and study the secret mantra Vajrayana. And particularly among the secret mantra Vajrayana, to say that the Tibetan Vajrayana is actually true and we achieve the recognition that it is a true tradition of Vajrayana. And that is one reason that we need to take interest in this. So now we will recite the dedication prayers.